Chapter 4, Sensation and Perception. In this chapter, we're going to look at basic principles of sensation and perception, vision, hearing, other senses, and health and wellness. So could it be possible that what food looks like influences how it tastes? Our interpretation of the world and our reality is strongly shaped by our senses. Sensation occurs when a person receives stimulus energy from the external environment. And that process of transferring physical energy into electrochemical energy is called transduction. Perception occurs when a person organizes and interprets sensory information in order to give it meaning. Sensation and perception are two separate processes that go hand in hand. Sensation can be considered the raw materials of experience, while perception is the experience itself. So there's bottom-up and top-down processing. Bottom-up processing is initiated by sensory input. It occurs when the information from the external environment is registered and sent up to the brain for interpretation. It occurs with first-time information, meaning that information is not familiar to the person. Whereas top-down processing occurs with higher level of cognitive processing. It starts in the brain and occurs with information that a person is already familiar with. The purpose of perception is to take information from the outside world and represent it internally. And if you look at it from an evolutionary standpoint, the purpose of perception is to adapt stimuli in order to survive. And this is a unified information processing system, taking information in as well as using information we've already stored. So we have sensory receptors. They engage in the bottom-up process of converting external energy patterns into neurological energy patterns. So sensory receptors are cells that detect and transmit information to sensory nerves in the brain. Sensory receptors set off action potentials in sensory neurons, which then carry the information to the central nervous system. They're also called afferent nerves, and you can see here that they all have a different look or shape to them. So the sense organs and sensory receptors have three classes based on the type of energy that's being transmitted. So the first is photoreception, which involves the detection of light. The next one is mechanoreception, which is the detection of pressure, vibrations, and movement perceived, such as touch, hearing, and the equilibrium. The third class is chemoreception, which is the detection of chemical stimuli that's detected as smell and taste. There is such a thing called synesthesia, where on rare occasions senses can become confused. Synesthesia refers to an experience in which one sense induces an experience in another sense. So for instance, a person might see music, or they might taste words. And if you go to YouTube and search up synesthesia, you will find some examples. Another phenomenon along that line is phantom limb pain. It's another case in which senses become confused. Individuals who have lost limbs report feeling pain in that limb even though it no longer exists. So thresholds are about how sensitive one's sensation is. And we have absolute thresholds, which is the minimum amount of energy needed for a person to detect something. So if a stimulus falls below the threshold, then a person does not experience it. Under ideal circumstances, a person's absolute thresholds are very low. The problem is there's so much noise around people that they cannot detect half of the stimuli that's confronting them. Noise is the term given to irrelevant and competing stimuli. So here on the screen you can see for vision, an absolute threshold has been determined to be about a candle flame being seen 30 miles away on a dark, clear night. Now the key is there a dark, clear night. Hearing a ticking clock at 20 feet under quiet conditions. Smell, 1 drop of perfume diffused throughout 3 rooms. Taste, a teaspoon of sugar and 2 gallons of water. Touch, the wing of a fly falling on your neck from a distance of 1 centimeter. We have a lot of competing noises that we're having to deal with. The difference threshold refers to the difference that must exist between 2 stimuli before you can tell there's a difference. So for instance, if you go to the gym and you pick up some dumbbells and you're using them and all of a sudden you're like, hey, wait, they feel different. and you look and you've got, a 20-pound and a 30-pound weight, but you're able to tell the difference. So the difference threshold is how much weight difference would there need to be for you to tell the difference. This is also the just noticeable difference. So this difference threshold increases as a stimulus becomes stronger, and at the very levels of stimulation, a small change can be detected, but at very high levels, small changes are less likely to be detected. So Weber's law, he did work around the just noticeable difference, and his principle is that two stimuli must differ by a constant proportion to be perceived as different. So if you add 1 candle to 20 candles, that equals a notice difference. But if you added 1 candle to 120 candles, no difference would be detected. His law is the idea that there has to be a constant minimum percentage of difference rather than a constant amount to be perceived as different. So subliminal perception, the influence of information that's below the level of consciousness. There was a scientist named Vicari who did a study in a movie theater where he would look at how much popcorn people would eat or soda, and he believed that when they flashed more on the screen about popcorn and soda that the consumption went up. But they were unable to replicate that study. Strahan, on the other hand, had 2 groups of people. They had them doing some type of task, and one of the groups would see or read about words that went with being thirsty, and the other group non-thirsty. And then they let them go gave them a break. And what they did is they watched how much they drank. And they did find that the people who had the words that were along the lines of being thirsty or related to it actually did drink a little bit more. But the thing is how much more does it need to be significant? If it's only a couple percent, that's really not a lot. Looking at signal detection. Have you ever been somewhere and you're all by yourself, it's dark, it's quiet, maybe you're not familiar with the place, and all of a sudden you hear a noise? Or you're like, did I hear a noise? Was that a noise? Was that the door rattling? Was that the window? Was that my car alarm? And we start wondering if we really heard something. Signal detection theory focuses on decision making about stimuli while in the presence of uncertainty. So it depends on the individual and the contextual variation, such as whether you're tired, you're expecting something, or the urgency of the moment. Information acquisition refers to the information that is produced in a brain scan, and criterion is the basis for making a decision about the available information. So in signal detection theory, there are 4 possible outcomes: hit, miss, false alarm, and correct rejection. So have you ever had a hearing test and they ask you to raise your hand every time you hear a noise? Did you sometimes think, I think I heard a noise, but I'm not sure? Well, what they're talking about here is all the possible outcomes. You could say, yes, I see it, and hit correct, but it was a false alarm. You could say, yes, I see it, and it wasn't there, which is a false alarm, or it was there and it's correct, as you can see. Or I didn't see it, but it wasn't, so you're okay. Or I didn't see it and it was there, which means it was wrong again. So some of the factors affecting perception are attention, focusing on a narrowed aspect of the environment. Think of a very busy restaurant. The buzz is really loud, but when you're sitting there engrossed in a conversation with someone, it's like all of that goes away and you can hear them just fine. And someone walking in to join you may sit down and go, oh my God, it's so loud in here. But it hasn't been for you because you were focused. That is selective attention, or called the cocktail party effect. Now, the Stroop effect is a failure of selection, and I'm going to show you that here in a second. Attention, we look for, our brain is trained to look for novelty, size, color, movement, and emotions. And there's also emotion-induced blindness, that we don't see things when we're really upset in one way or the other. And then there's inattentional blindness, that we're not paying attention, so we miss something. If you go to YouTube, you can look for a clip on inattentional blindness and look for one that asks you to count how many passes you see of a basketball being thrown, and you'll see what I'm talking about. So the Stroop effect, what I'm going to have you do is look at, and as fast as you can, name each color of ink used to print each of the rectangles below. So when I flip these over, it's going to show you words. And as fast as you can, name the color of ink used to print each word. Ignore what the word says. Now remember, as fast as you can. Go. Did you have trouble? It messes with us, right? Because even though we're not supposed to pay attention to what the word says, it messes with you because you see green, but it's in red. And so our brain wants to say red. Perceptual sets also mess with us because we have a predisposition or readiness to perceive something in a particular way. Like it looks like this lady's holding up this building, even though we know that's not the case. Because she's close to it, her hand's on it, it makes it look like she actually is. So perceptual set is a psychological filter that occurs when we are processing information about the environment. Children are more accurate than adults at identifying some tasks because they haven't built up these perceptual sets yet. I want you to count the number of aces of spades when shown the cards on the left. Okay, how many did you get? All right, now do the other side. How many did you get? Most people see 2 to 3 aces of spades in the set on the left because they're red spades and we're not used to seeing red, so we don't count them, we skip them. They're actually 5, and most people see 5 of aces of spades on the right because they're in black, and that's what we expect. So here's just some different things to see with perceptual set expectancy. Do you see a woman or a man? Or both? Do you see a candle holder or 2 faces? Do you see the man playing the saxophone or a woman's face? Do you see a young woman looking away or an old woman looking down? Other things that affect our perception are sensory adaptation, which occurs when there's a change in the responsiveness of sensory system based on the average level of surrounding stimulation. So think about when you're in a very dark room, eventually you're able to start seeing things because your eyes adjust. Or if you really start listening for something, your ears will adjust. Or if you stick your hands in cold water, eventually you adjust. Think about jumping in a cold pool. Eventually you adjust. So sensory adaptation is when our sensitivity to a constant or repetitive stimulus decreases over the time. We pay the most attention to changes in our environment, and this prevents us from being overwhelmed with stimuli. Our hearing adjusts to our environment. It adjusts to sounds of wilderness if walking in a forest. And sensory adaptation allows you to hear a twig break in the distance so you can decide whether you're safe or need to run. This is a video called The Sound of Silence, and you're welcome to look for it on YouTube. And it talks about how being super silent can really bother people, and they put them in this room that absorbs sound. So even when you think everything is really, really quiet, sitting in a room with the lights off, you've got other noises that are taking place that are still bouncing so that you can tell that there's space around you in the room. And in this case, the sound is absorbed, so some people feel very claustrophobic. So if you want to check that out, you are more than welcome. Extrasensory perception, or ESP, means that someone can detect information from the world without receiving any concrete sensory input. An example of ESP is telepathy, the ability to read a person's mind. There are many reasons to consider ESP as questionable. Scientist Daryl Bem conducted studies in 2011 and hypothesized that participants would have better recall on words that they were going to be assigned in the future to study. Results were that they learned about 2% better the words they were going to study than the ones they were not going to study. But 2% again, remember? So flip a coin 100 times. If it turns up heads 52 times, do you think the coin is rigged? Sensation involves the detection of energy from the environment. How does that come into play? Statistics are not a substitute for sound, rational predictions and conclusions. All right, moving on to light. Light is a form of electromagnetic energy. It travels through space in waves. The wavelength of light is the distance from the peak of one wave to the peak of the next. Amplitude is the height of the wave, and it is associated with the brightness of visual stimuli. Purity is the mixture of wavelengths and light. What humans can detect in light is a very small part of the actual light waves that are out there. So if you look at this little part right here, this is visual light. Look at all of this here. All of these waves, and we're only picking up that small portion. Here's an example of shorter wavelengths and longer wavelengths, and what they're looking at is the distance between the peaks. Same thing here. This is something you can look up on YouTube if you look for Mythbusters Rubens tube. And it is a good way to see. It's sound waves, but it gives you an idea what waves look like. And they played music through a tube that had gas in it, and they lit it. And as the music plays, you can see how it pushed the fire that's in there at different levels through the holes because of the waves. It's really neat if you can look for it. Here's another video that you might want to look at. It's Shattering Glass by Resonance, and this is where they're able to hit a certain frequency and it actually shatters the glass, and it's a sound frequency. The eye is set up like a camera, and it gets the picture of the world for you. The sclera is the white outer part of the eye that gives the eye its shape and protects it from injury. The iris is the colored part of the eye. The pupil, which appears black, is the opening in the center of the iris. The iris contains muscles that allow the pupil to get larger and smaller depending on how much light's coming in. The cornea is the clear membrane on the outer part of the surface of the eye in order to focus it on the back of the eye. The lens is transparent and somewhat flexible. When a person is looking at an object far away, the lens has a relatively flat shape. However, when a person is looking at an object closer, more bending of the light is needed and it has more of a rounder shape. The retina is the light-sensitive surface that records what the person sees. So this part back here. It converts the information to a neural impulse for processing in the brain. The retina is the most important mechanism for sight. This fovea here is in the center of the retina, contains only cones, and it's important to many visual tasks. And so we're going to look at rods and cones. Rods are sensitive to light and allow a person to see at night, whereas cones are used for color perception and they're not very helpful at night. Rods and cones transduce light into electrochemical impulses that go through the bipolar cells and then move on to the ganglion cells, and the axons of the ganglion cells make up the optic nerve. The blind spot in the retina has neither cones nor rods. So here's a rod. These are cones. You can see the different shapes here, the photoreceptor cells. You have 120 million rods and only 6 million cones. So color versus dim light. This is just an example of kind of the differences. Rods, black and white, dimly lit. Thin and long, not on the fovea. Cones, color, well lit light. Short and fat on the fovea and scattered outside of it. The fovea is densely populated with cones that are vital to many visual tasks. Here are the ganglion cells, which then moves the information on to the bipolar cells, which then move it on into the optic nerve. There's the blind spot. Visual processing. The optic nerve leaves the eye and carries information about light to the brain. Stimuli in the left visual field travel to the right side of the brain and vice versa. The optic chasm is where the nerve fibers divide and the visual information crosses over to the opposite side of the brain. So as you can see here, left field, it does come in the left eye and the right eye, but then watch, it comes here, here, and everything goes here to the right. Stuff coming in on the right comes in both, and then both end up over to the right. Thalamus and your visual cortex. Feature detectors are neurons or groups of neurons in the brain's visual system, and they respond to particular features of a stimulus. Parallel processing is what or where questions that need to be answered in order for people to respond appropriately to a visual stimulus. What pathway is the temporal lobe and processes information about what the object is. The where pathway is located in the parietal lobe and processes information about an object's location. Parallel processing is a simultaneous distribution of information across different neural pathways. It helps information move rapidly through the brain. It would be too slow if everything was processed in a serial manner. So it's processed across neural pathways. Binding is when we bring together all of the information and integrate it. This processed by different pathways or cells. It involves coupling the activity of various cells and pathways that deal with different things such as color, shape, and movement, and pulling it all together. So color is a pattern of neural responses that generate color vision. The trichromatic theory states that color perception is produced by 3 types of receptors. Color blindness refers to seeing some colors but not others. Color blindness depends on which of the 3 kinds of cones is not working. Red-green colorblind is pretty common, especially men. So here you have 2 circles. They're red with green numbers in them. Can you see them? Trichromatic theory states that color perception is produced by these 3 types of cones, and that in the retina, they're particularly sensitive to different but overlapping ranges of wavelengths. Stare at this image for 25 to 30 seconds. Keep looking. Now what do you see besides the green at the bottom? Do you see an after image? What about here? See the dress in the middle? Is it black and blue or is it white and gold? If you see black and blue, your retina cones are higher functioning, which results in your eyes doing subtractive mixing. If you see white and gold, your eyes don't work very well in dim light, so the retina rods see white, making them less light sensitive, which causes an addictive mixing of green and red, which makes gold. This dress went viral. Somebody had worn this dress to a wedding and in a picture made some comment on social media about it, and people were like, what are you talking about? That's not the color. And this big old argument between those who could see blue and black versus the white and gold took place. So those after images we were talking about are sensations that remain after a stimulus is removed. The opponent process theory states that cells in the visual system respond to red, green, and blue, yellow colors. A cell excited by red and green could be inhibited, or a cell excited by blue and yellow could be inhibited. Negative after image is looking at complementary colors when they're viewed after gazing at an image. It has to do with the fact that the color receptors in the eye are apparently sensitive as pairs. When one color is turned off, the other color, the receptors briefly turned on. Color is a pattern of neural responses that creates your color vision. And here's the complementary color pairs. So cells in the visual system respond to red, green, or blue, yellow colors. We take in a lot of information, dimensions such as shape, depth, motion, and constancy to interpret and put a big picture together of our world. Gestalt believes that perceptions are naturally organized according to certain patterns. So we've looked at some of those already in terms of like the figure-ground relationship, and you have to decide which figure is in the foreground versus the background. Also other things such as closure, that we perceive things as connected even if they are not completely connected. We fill that space in. And proximity is that we see objects that are near each other as one unit. And similarity is that we see objects that are similar to each other as one unit. So here's an example of the foreground-background relationship. Closure and proximity. We know this is a triangle even though it's not closed. We know this is a rectangle even though it's not closed. We know that this is an animal even though those are not closed in. We see lines here even though they're not closed in. And then also here, we see a red square, right? However, it's a bunch of dots and squares, but we put that together because it's similar in shape and size. So the brain constructs perception of 3D from 2D images processed by the retina, but we use binocular cues. They depend on the information from the right and the left eye. Convergence is when both eyes focus on the same object, and disparity is the use of the differences between the two images from the left and right eyes to determine depth. We also look at familiar size and overlap. Familiar size is based on what we've learned from experience. The higher an object is positioned in a picture, the further away we see it. And also items further away take up less space on our retina. When we perceive objects that overlapped each other, then we perceive one to be closer than the other. And shading depends on the location of the viewer and the light source. Texture and gradient becomes finer as something gets further away from us. And those who do not have two functioning eyes cannot perceive depth the same way. So there's shading, and it depends on where we're at and the light source. And then if you look here, the people that are up higher look further away. We perceive that if someone's higher in our visual range, that they are further away. Also, that someone that's in clear vision versus blurry, that they are closer than the blurred vision. Things get smaller as they go away from us. In terms of gradient and texture, we perceive that things as they get smaller are going away. So if you draw it that way, we perceive it as going away from us. And then humans have specialized motion detectors. We get feedback from our bodies that tell us that either we are or something else is moving. In some animals, that motion perception is a means of survival. Apparent emotion occurs when an object is stationary, but we perceive it as moving. Apparent motion is watching like an IMAX movie. Two forms of apparent motion are stroboscopic motion and movement after effects. Stare at this long enough. Does it move? Another idea that you can look at that kind of messes with our brain, the spinning dancer, and I'm not going to click on it right now, but she spins and you watch it and it looks like it's going clockwise, and you can blink and it looks like it's going the other way. So if you haven't seen that, you can look for that. Perceptual constancy is recognition that objects don't physically change just because they get further away from us and look smaller. We know they haven't changed. So sensory information, like retinal images, may change, but our perceptual or interpretation does not change. We understand constancy in size, shape, and color. So looking at sound, for wavelength, sound waves are vibrations in the air that are processed by the auditory system. Wavelength determines the frequency of the sound wave or the number of cycles that pass through a point in a given time. Pitch is the perceptual interpretation of the frequency of sound. High frequency sounds are perceived as having high pitch, such as a soprano voice. Likewise, low frequency sounds have a low pitch, such as a bass voice. Amplitude is measured in decibels and is the amount of pressure produced by sound waves relative to the standard. Loudness is the perception of sound waves' amplitude, and the perceptual quality of a sound is known as timbre, which is responsible for us noticing the quality differences in human voices. So the ear transmits a high fidelity version of sounds in the world to the brain for interpretation. The outer ear contains the pinna, which is the visible outer part of the ear, and also contains the auditory canal. The middle ear, after passing through the pinna, sound waves go through the auditory canal to the middle ear. The eardrum vibrates in response to sound. The hammer and the anvil and the stirrup, all three of these little bones, when they vibrate, the sound waves are transmitted into the inner ear. And the inner ear contains the oval window, cochlea, and the basal membrane. The purpose of the inner ear is to induce sound waves into neural impulses that are then sent to the brain for interpretation. In humans and other mammals, there are hair cells called cilia that move against the tectoral membrane. They are the sensory receptors of the ear. Hair cells can be damaged from too much loud noise. Cochlear implants are small electronic devices that are surgically implanted in the ear and head to allow those who are deaf to detect sound. So here's another image here. You can see the hair cells. There's two theories about how the ear registers frequency of sound. Place theory states that each frequency produces vibrations at a particular spot on the basilar membrane. Helpful in explaining high frequency noises, but not low frequencies that cause a large part of the basal membrane to be displaced, making it hard to identify the location it hits on the membrane. Frequency theory states the perception of a sound frequency depends on how often the auditory nerve fires. High frequencies fire more. The limitation is that a single neuron has a maximum firing rate of about 1,000 times per second, so frequencies that require more rapid fire cannot be explained by this theory. The volley principle states that a cluster of nerve cells can fire neural impulses in rapid succession, producing a volley of impulses. They team up and alternate their neural firing, so the combined frequency increases the rate above the 1,000 times per second. So the pathway of auditory information goes into the cochlea, the audio nerve, brainstem, and the temporal lobe. Once the information is picked up from the environment, it has to move to the brain for interpretation. Information about sound moves from the hair cells of the inner ear to the auditory nerve, which then carries the neural impulses to the brain. In terms of localizing sound, a sound coming from the left reaches the left ear faster than the right. The sound reaching the closest ear is more intense because it did not have to travel as far, also because the other ear is in the sound shadow of the listener's head. Differences in timing of the sound and the intensity of the sound help a person to locate it. So some other senses are touch, in which we detect mechanical energy or pressure against the skin. The lifting of a single hair causes pressure on the surrounding skin, and we can also feel a tiny pencil point. Vestibular sense tells us whether our head and body are tilted, moving, slowing down, or speeding up. It works in concert with the kinesthetic senses to coordinate proprioceptive feedback. Proprioceptive feedback is information about the position of our limbs and body parts in relation to other body parts. Touch is when we detect mechanical energy or pressure against the skin. For touch, it goes through the receptors to the spinal cord, to the thalamus, to the somatosensory cortex of the parietal lobe. Temperature, we have thermoreceptors for warm and cold. They're sensory nerve endings under the skin that respond to changes in temperature at or near the skin and provide input to the body's temperature at 98.6 degrees. Warm receptors respond to the warming of the skin and the cold to the cooling of the skin. When warm and cold receptors are close together and are simultaneously stimulated, we experience the simulation of hotness. The cutaneous senses are the skin receptors on the skin for temperature, touch, and pain. Sensory fibers from the receptors in the skin enter the spinal cord, and from there the information travels to the brainstem. At the brainstem, most fibers from the body cross over to the opposite side of the brain. The information goes into the thalamus, which projects the map of the body's somatosensory areas of the parietal lobes and the cerebral cortex. Pain warns us of damage to the body by sensing mechanical pressure changes and temperature sensations. Vital for survival and fast acting to minimize damage. Mechanical pain receptors respond primarily to pressure. Heat pain receptors respond primarily to strong heat. And other pain receptors have to do both. Many are sensitive to chemicals and respond to pain-producing substances. Pain receptors have high threshold for firing than the receptors for temperature and touch. They respond mainly to physical stimuli that distort them or chemical stimuli that irritate them. Prostaglandins are produced by sore joints and torn muscles and stimulate the receptors and cause the experience of pain. Drugs like aspirin reduce the pain by reducing the prostaglandin production. Neural pathways transmit pain messages. There are fast pathways that go directly to the thalamus to motor and sensory areas of the cerebral cortex, and these transmit information on sharp, localized pain. And they serve as a warning system. It takes about less than a second. It's like putting your hand on a hot stove. It's quick. The slow pathway travels through the limbic system to the cerebral cortex, which delays the arrival by seconds, which is like more for unpleasant or nagging pain. There's evidence that pain signals are turned on and off in a chemical process, probably by endorphins. Pain perception is different for different people based on culture, ethnic context, and Rh negative factors. People with Rh negative blood have been found to have a higher sensitivity to pain. Gate control theory of pain states that the spinal column contains a neural gate that can be opened or closed, and when the gate is open, it allows the perception of pain, but when it's closed, it doesn't. It also is no longer seen as true, this theory, but turning pain signals on and off is probably due to a chemical process involving the endorphin. An important factor to consider in the realm of gender differences in pain is the role of cultural expectations. Men are raised to think they are supposed to be tougher and not to feel as much pain as women. Cultural and ethnic context can determine the degree to which an individual experiences pain. Empathy is the ability to feel what others feel. Mirror touch synesthesia is the feeling of empathy, but on a different level. This experience of tactile sensations when a person sees someone else being touched, feels someone else getting a shot. So you actually feel their pain. With taste and smell, they're responsible for the processing of chemicals in the environment. They can be stimulated at the same time. A person uses their sense of taste to select food and to regulate food intake. There are papillae, which are small bumps on your tongue that contain taste buds, which are the receptors for taste. The information picked up by the taste bud receptors travel to the brain for interpretation. The 4 different taste qualities that a person has are sweet, sour, bitter, and salty. Different regions of the tongue are more sensitive to some taste than others. The tip of the tongue is the most sensitive to sweet and salty, and the sides are more sensitive to sour, and the rear is more sensitive to bitter. Researchers also recognize a 5th sense called umami, which is yummy or delicious taste experienced by the flavor of L-glutamate. Smell. Humans use the sense of smell to decide what to eat as an odor tracker. The olfactory epithelium lines the roof of the nasal cavity and contains a sheet of receptor cells for smell. The receptor cells are covered with millions of hair-like antennae. The neural pathway first goes to the olfactory area of the temporal lobes and then goes to the various brain regions, especially the limbic system. With taste, we're detecting chemicals that have been dissolved in saliva. You have about 10,000 taste buds on your tongue that are replaced about every 2 weeks. As we age, the renewal of the taste buds decrease, and an older person may only have 5,000 working at a time. Kinesthetic senses provide information about movement, posture, and orientation. Vestibular sense provides information about balance and movement. It tells us whether or not our head or our body is tilted, moving, slowing down, speeding up, and it works in concert with kinesthetic senses to coordinate your proprioceptive feedback, which we talked a little bit about earlier as well. It is very important to take care of your eyes and your hearing and all of your senses. For your eyes, avoid eating high-fat food and smoking. Eat a diet in vitamins A, E, C, zinc, and beta-carotene. Eat a variety of fruits and vegetables. Read in appropriate lighting, 3 times brighter than the rest of the room light, with your work at eye level about 16 inches away. Wear sunglasses to protect from UV A and B damaging rays, and get a glaucoma test, especially after the age of 60. For your hearing, most dangerous threat is loud noise, listening through earphones or earbuds, and it's safe to listen to music for about 5 hours at 70% of the volume, at 90% no more than 90 minutes. So you need to be careful. So in review, describe sensation and perception, describe the structural components of the eye and how the brain processes visual information, identify the structural parts and functions of the ear, and explain how the ear detects sound. Explain how the skin, chemical, kinesthetic, and vestibular senses work, and identify the everyday practices associated with protecting your vision and hearing.